G7, Donald Trump has said that Israel must be more responsible in Lebanon and the war with Hezbollah has gone on too long. Too many people are being killed, he said. He made the comments at the G7 summit in France, where the world leaders have been seeking clarity on his deal with Iran. The White House says that the agreement is now complete and their focus is shifting to Ukraine. The UK appears to be very much on the sidelines of all this. There's been no bilateral meeting between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer, though the Prime Minister insists it's not a snub. We're going to have extensive analysis from Ivor and Michael here in the studio. Also from Mark Stone in Washington, Adam Parsons in Jerusalem, as well as our political editor, Beth Rigby, who is live at the summit. But first, this evening, here's our Europe correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, who reports now from Evian.
This G7 might be set on the tranquil banks of Lake Geneva, but it has been a summit of two wars and one man. President Trump landed in Evian with a spring in his step, fresh from his birthday celebrations and having secured an agreement with Iran just hours before departing Washington.
We were focused on Iran. That's going to be in the rear view mirror.
European leaders stayed out of the Iran war, and they took a lot of flack from Trump as a result. But they are now preparing for a formal ceasefire if it is signed across the water in Geneva later this week.
At the G7 here, we've been discussing the details of that deal and how we get the Strait of Hormuz open as quickly as possible. As you will know, President Macron and I put together a group of countries prepared to play their part in terms of reassurance to get vessels through the Strait.
Trump started the war together with Israel, but has ended it on his own terms, and he seems none too happy with his ally.
I've had a great relationship with Bibi, but now Bibi has to be more responsible with respect to Lebanon. Lebanon used to be a great country. It was a country where you had professors, doctors, lawyers. The great intellect was in Lebanon. Now it's terrible. I would say of all countries, they've been treated the worst. And they can't defend themselves. And they have Hezbollah, which is a problem for them. So, no, I'm not happy with the way Israel has handled themselves with Lebanon and with Hezbollah.
The leaders of Qatar and the UAE were also invited to Evian. More than anyone else here, they will want to know the details of Trump's deal because it will directly affect them. The two countries have both taken a lot of incoming fire from Iran and will no doubt be wondering what it was all for and whether it was worth it. Volodymyr Zelensky arrived here this morning to speak to the G7 leaders.
Everything good. Yeah.
He was embraced by President Macron. The war in Ukraine was on the official agenda and is now back on Trump's radar. After a 2-hour session with all the leaders, he met privately with Trump and Marco Rubio. Trump likes winners, and Zelensky needs to persuade him that Ukraine is slowly turning the tables on Russia. The European leaders have a really difficult diplomatic balancing act to tread. On the one hand, yeah, they really want to re-engage Trump on the Ukrainian issue. But on the other hand, not to such an extent that they lose control themselves. For a long time, Trump was hugely critical of Europe for not supporting Ukraine enough and for relying on America. Well, that's all changed now. Europe is the biggest financial donor to Ukraine. And for that reason, they believe, with some justification, that they have now earned a seat at the negotiating table. The problem is, Donald Trump, being who he is, he'll kind of want to do it alone. The French have set the bar low for this summit. Keeping Trump on message, and even just keeping him here for the duration, will be seen as a success. But if they can also make some progress on Ukraine, then that could make this gathering genuinely worthwhile. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, in Evian.
Let's talk to our political editor, Beth Rigby, who is also at the summit. And Keir Starmer in a rather difficult position here. He's on the world stage in the very week that he could face a by-election that, you know, ultimately could determine his political fate.
It certainly is a difficult dance he is trying to display here, isn't it? Why he tries to project strength on the world stage, and at home he's facing a rolling leadership crisis and potential challenge even as early as this weekend. But it's like suspended animation here. We saw him earlier. He seemed very upbeat. He was very focused on Ukraine. He's just met with President Zelensky, and Lady Starmer also had attended that meeting. And when we asked him, when he spoke to journalists earlier up at the summit, about the meeting, about Ukraine, about the conversations that they had this morning, he said that there had been a mood change on Ukraine. He said there was real unity. He spoke of a real sense of things changing in terms of Ukraine now taking territory from Russia and sanctions biting in for Russia. And then you've got, as Ali was saying in that report there, a much more enthusiastic Trump saying that talks were very good. And you think about what happened between Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office, but a year or so ago, where he said to Zelensky, you've got no cards to play, you don't hold the cards. There is definitely a warming of that relationship there, with Trump coming here to the G7 in France saying that Putin needs to do a deal. And I genuinely think normally these places are talking shops, nothing much happens, but there definitely is a sense that there could be some progress on Ukraine. Zelensky talked about the US being more open to air defence. There could perhaps be more sanctions come in too. So actually, on that, there is some progress. But as you said, for Starmer, he's trying to downplay this lack of bilateral meeting with President Trump. When he was at the G7 in Canada last year, I was there, I remember it well. They were signing a trade deal, they had a bilat, they were shaking hands, they were doing an impromptu press conference for the world to see. They could not have been closer. That is just not happening here. Now, Starmer was very keen to say that he'd had dinner and he'd sat with Trump for a couple of hours and they get on very well and they've talked about a lot of issues, but he hasn't been afforded this bilateral this time around. And you know what Trump's like. Trump likes winners, and it could be that he's eyeing this Prime Minister now thinking this guy is a loser and he could soon lose the keys to number 10. And in that sense, it must be quite difficult for Starmer to assert himself here at this summit. He does, of course, have very close relations with Chancellor Merz of Germany and President Macron of France. And from his perspective, the Prime Minister, I have to say, seems quite chipper.
OK, Beth, thank you very much indeed. Let's go to our US correspondent. Mark Stone is in Washington. And Mark, let's talk about Iran just a little bit more. Are we closer to knowing, or are you closer to knowing, what is in this kind of framework deal, this page-and-a-half memorandum?
Well, we haven't got the deal. It hasn't been published, which in itself is very odd. I mean, if it is such a good deal, as J.D. Vance keeps telling us it is, he's been on the airwaves for the past day or so. All over cable news. He was on The View on ABC this morning. That's kind of like America's loose women. He is everywhere trying to tell everyone this is a great deal, and yet they haven't published it. If it's so good, why haven't they published it? We just don't know. Look, having just watched Ali's report there, listening to what Beth's saying about Ukraine, look, I think there's something fascinating going on at the G7. Wouldn't it be convenient if President Trump can suddenly throw a few bones on the Ukraine issue, suddenly suggest that perhaps he's more interested in Ukraine than he was before, more willing to support Zelensky than perhaps he was before? Wouldn't that be a neat diversion for everyone away from a disastrous deal that he has signed himself up to in Iran? Maybe, but it is clear that the deal in Iran, from the briefings that we're getting behind the scenes from senior officials and from what J.D. Vance is saying publicly, this deal is actually inferior to the one that Obama signed up to, which was a genuine deal, a deal which was kind of had locked-in assurances. It's inferior to that deal, a deal, by the way, that President Trump ripped up, and it was only after he ripped it up that Iran decided, well, screw you, America, we're now going to start enriching uranium, and so it did. There is some leaks going on online between in terms of analysts and Iran watchers about what the deal might be. No one has published it officially. There is one sort of 14-point plan that suggests that is purported to be very close to the deal. I then sent that on to a source in a Middle Eastern government, a Gulf Arab nation, and I said, look, is this close to what the deal is? And the source said to me, I've not seen the final text, but the above, what I sent him, looks very legit based on the brief we got. Well, if that is the legitimate deal or anything close to it, then, Mark, it represents a stunning capitulation and defeat by Trump's America.
Right, OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Let's go straight to Jerusalem and our Middle East correspondent, Adam Parsons. And Adam, before we talk, let's just listen to what President Trump was saying about Israel and about Hezbollah a little earlier.
Israel's fighting Hezbollah too long and too many people are being killed. And you don't have to knock down an apartment house every time you're looking for somebody, because there are a lot of people in those apartment houses, and they're not all Hezbollah, that I can tell you. And I suggested to Israel to let Syria take care of Hezbollah. Because to be honest with you, I think they do a better job of doing it.
So, Adam, a bitter criticism of Netanyahu, who clearly doesn't like the deal or what he thinks the deal will be.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable, actually, that if just a few months ago, you'd have looked at Trump and Netanyahu and said, these guys are operating in tandem. There's a period when Netanyahu was the #1 visitor to the White House. I remember standing here as they were sort of launching their coordinated attack against Iran just a few months ago. Well, how times change. Benjamin Netanyahu not just isn't invited to the sidelines at G7, I understand he hasn't been given a copy of any of the wording of the Memorandum of Understanding, the agreement that has been drawn up by the United States and Iran, in which clearly Israel has an enormous vested interest. Just let that sink in. America and Israel attacked Iran, and this deal to bring that war to a close, the Prime Minister of Israel isn't even given a copy of it to read. Now, what we understand is that one of the things that Trump and the Iranians have come up with is that Israel should be withdrawing from Lebanon. Well, that isn't going to happen. Netanyahu made that clear yesterday when he spoke to Israeli journalists, and sources close to him today have reiterated that to me again. Ultimately, they're not going to stand and take orders from the United States. But Lebanon is crucial to this. Why? Because Hezbollah, backed and funded by Iran, is in southern Lebanon, and Israel has gone very far into that country to try and basically eradicate Hezbollah. It's killed 3,500 people. It's displaced a huge number. It's caused massive devastation and disruption. And Israel does not want to pull out now simply to try and get this deal through, because this deal is hugely unpopular among the political establishment here. It is seen as, frankly, having failed to achieve any of the original war aims. Iran's missile arsenal, well, American sources say it's still about 70% strong. The nuclear program, the deal will say, we'll talk about that for the next 60 days. Israelis will say, well, wasn't that one of the points of the war, to try to degrade the nuclear program? Funding for proxies, sounds like that is completely off the table. The potential for regime change. Well, the old Ayatollah is dead, but the IRGC's power has been increased. So from an Israeli perspective, there is nothing they like about this deal. But Benjamin Netanyahu, this great survivor of a prime minister, is now in a horrible political position. On the one hand, he's got an election later this year. He cannot possibly be seen to capitulate to an outside country, even if it is America, and to become a sort of puppet prime minister who just does what Donald Trump tells him to do. So he's going to have to keep his forces in Lebanon just to make a point now. On the other hand, does he really want to fall out with Donald Trump when, let's be honest, Israel has just about no loyal allies in the world at the moment. Very recently, just a few days ago, they had the Prime Minister of Somaliland coming here. If you haven't heard of Somaliland, it's because I think Israel is the only country that recognises it as an official nation. That's how desperate Israel is for friends at the moment, and that is how desperate the vice is that is tightening around Benjamin Netanyahu.
Adam, thank you very much indeed. Let's come back here now, speak again to Ivor Bennett, our Moscow correspondent, and Michael Clarke, our defence analyst. And I want to talk more about the yacht incident in the Channel just a moment. But first of all, this whole issue now of changing focus to Ukraine. Ivor, is there any evidence that Putin is now, getting close to wanting to talk seriously?
Not at the moment, not in public, certainly. We did hear from the Russians today, from the Kremlin, and they dismissed or denied this claim from Zelensky that he had invited Putin to the G7 for talks there. They said that's not true, and he said that if Zelensky does want to talk, then he should come to Moscow. So repeating that invitation, open invitation to the Russian capital, which clearly Zelensky's never going to take up because of fears over his safety. So publicly, certainly, they're still playing hardball. But I think the Europeans are clearly hoping, and the Ukrainians, that now that Trump is kind of done with Iran, he'll turn his attentions to Ukraine, especially with Russia at least perceived to be more on the defensive. And the evidence we saw today at the G7, I think from the Europeans' point of view, was positive. There were lots of warm words from Donald Trump after his first meeting with Zelensky, lots of warm body language as well there. Trump called the meeting very good. He said that Russia should make a peace deal. He's due to meet Zelensky again later today. But I think, as Mark Stone was alluding to as well, this doesn't mean that Donald Trump is suddenly going to become Vladimir Putin's biggest critic. We've heard Trump say this kind of stuff before. He's very good when he wants to at telling people what they want to hear. So he could just be kind of playing nice here, telling the G7 leaders what they want to hear, and then not following up. And despite those warm words, for example, Zelensky reportedly in that meeting asked Trump to kind of raise the prospect of more sanctions. And at the moment, those are not forthcoming.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, Michael, isn't it, that the European members of NATO are clearly worried that Donald Trump refocuses on Ukraine, but that involves him not applying the kind of maximum pressure on Putin that the European leaders seem to think is what is going to work.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, this G7 meeting was in France, so President Macron had the agenda, and he put Ukraine at the top of the agenda. That's his right to do that. So he made the Americans focus on Ukraine first. And undoubtedly, the Europeans had a mission here, saying, look, Zelensky's here. I mean, Ukraine is a long way away from getting into the EU, even further away from getting into NATO. But there it is at a G7 meeting. There is Zelensky with all of the other most powerful people in the Western world. He's there. And the Europeans, in a sense, had a message, I think, to the Americans, which is that Zelensky does have cards to play. The Ukrainians are not necessarily going to lose this war. It's the Russians who are now under some pressure, some. I mean, the pendulum hasn't swung all the way back again, but it's not swinging in Russia's direction because the Ukrainians have made really good use of their new drones, which they've been working on now for 6 months or so, this offensive that's been building up and building up. And we've seen what they can do now. And they're pressuring the Russians on the front line around Pokrovsk, but they're also pressuring Russia in the rear areas. And in particular, the road from Rostov-on-Don in the south, major hub for the Russians, right through to Zankoy in Crimea. That R280 road, the R280, is now unsafe for the Russians to use as their major supply hub into Crimea. And so the Ukrainians are close to achieving what they couldn't achieve in 2023 with their big offensive, which is to make Crimea unsafe for the Russians, both in civilian terms and military terms. Yeah. And that's a big strategic win if they can do that. Yeah. That's a big strategic gain. If they go to ceasefire negotiations later in the year, the fact that they can threaten Crimea at will, if that's what they get to, would be a big help for them.
Just on the point of these casualties, I mean, the numbers of casualties are extraordinary, aren't they? But would that, the number of troops that Russia is losing, would that put pressure on Putin, do you think?
Well, there are several strands that are kind of gradually building up and to this picture where putting Putin under more pressure than he's been previously in 4.5 years, certainly. And the casualties is one thing. According to the UK and Europeans, it's the casualties are now up to 500,000. That's a huge number. Now, Russia doesn't talk about...
We're talking a month. What is is it like something like 30,000?
30,000 a month, yeah. Today, Richard Knighton was in front of the Lords Committee, and we're watching it, and he said the casualties, we think, he said, and he's Chief of Defence Staff, are running at 1,300 a day, 1,300 a day. Now, that's dead and injured.
Yeah.
Well, and that's certainly one kind of strand that's putting pressure on Putin, but that's not the only one. There's also the economy, rising prices, and people are feeling the pinch, and it's getting harder to fund this massive defence spending that's now 40% of the budget. There's also these drone attacks that Michael talked about, not just kind of in the front lines and behind them, but deep inside Russia. We saw some more today on an oil refinery not far from Moscow. All of this is gradually kind of building up to this real picture of pressure on Putin, and that's kind of leading to many diplomats that I speak to in Moscow, European diplomats, to believe that actually, Putin's now, the more he gets into this corner, what's he going to do? He's probably going to lash out, because that's the only option left, escalation. And that's his kind of route out of this. He's got to do something to kind of reclaim that narrative.